Okay, so from the approved codes of practice, here are some notes, a summary of what they consider to be adequate to make an assessment suitable and sufficient. So it must be a systematic general examination of the effects of work activities and the condition of the premises. So all quite straightforward so far. The very risk assessment process would be systematic and a general examination. There should be 5 or more. If there's 5 or more employees, you should record significant findings. But that's not to say that if there are less than 5 employees, you should not do the risk assessments at all. Should identify how risks arise and how they impact on those affected, and how they are to be managed. And so you want to consider this if you're doing a table, so you would have the hazard as a title for the hazard, rather than using the title for an entire process or procedure. So remember, the hazard is something with the potential to cause harm. So if you are cleaning out a vessel, that is not something with the potential to cause harm. It would be coming into contact with the chemical substances, the exposure to the chemical substances used to clean that vessel or that were stored in the vessel initially, that would have the potential to cause harm. Then you should really consider a new column which should say who may be harmed and how. And so you consider who is going to be affected, and then you can use this as an opportunity to make special consideration, should that be necessary, for certain types of employees in the workplace. And so we have extra requirements for those who are especially young, those are pregnant, those that are disabled. You should consider how those risks are to be managed. So you have existing control measures and then new control measures that you consider necessary to put in place. And then aims to help the employer identify what measures need to be taken. So you then need to identify what measures still need to be undertaken to make the workplace safe. So we have further consideration, two more slides of these. So identify risks, identify people affected. This is from a different author. Identify the level of detail in the risk assessment should be proportionate to the risk. So we're saying here that if you have a higher level of risk, you need to do more thorough and more detailed risk assessments for it. And so you'll notice in the templates you looked at earlier on in this part of the session that the level of where they perceive there to be a higher exposure to the risks, such as cold in the cold storage warehousing, or display screen equipment used in the office, then a more detailed risk assessment and more thorough control measures need to be put in place. We should ignore insignificant risks from life in general, unless exacerbated by the work activity. For instance, crossing the roads, as you would do in your own personal life, would be an insignificant risk because it was no higher than you would experience in your as a background level of risk in your day-to-day life. However, if you were a lollipop lady or a traffic officer and you were crossing the road every day, all the day, then you would consider that your exposure to that level of hazard was increased by the work you were carrying out. The level of risk arising out of the work activity should determine the degree of sophistication of the risk assessment. So again, it's kind of reiterating the level of detail in the risk assessment should be proportionate to the risk. You may need specialist advice for more complicated processes. So this is where necessary you should bring in either so both the people that are carrying out the process, but also the expert. So an expert in that particular work process. If you were doing a risk assessment on lasers, then you would want to get an expert in lasers in order to identify any control measures or, for that matter, any areas of risk or exposure to hazards which you were previously unaware of. It should detail the period of time which is likely to remain valid. And so your risk assessment should be reviewed and updated where necessary on a regular basis, which is typically annually, and with any change in the work environment or process. It needs to be practical. It needs to take account of the views of employees. It needs to involve management, because it's only the combination of the employees' input and the management's inputs that's going to get you a working solution to try to sensibly reduce the level of risk in a practical manner to that as low as reasonably practicable, ALARP. It may use model or generic risk assessments for businesses with many similar activities. So we can use, I'm sure you can all come up with a few examples for this. If you've got a chain of a fast food outlet, then you'll find that the risk assessments are going to be looking at similar hazards or the same hazards in the same situation in each and every one of their kitchens. However, they build their fast food restaurant chains in many different types of work premises, and so your slips and trips hazards, for instance, your slips and trips hazard in one building may be completely different to in the way in the level of risk that it poses and how it poses that level of risk than you get in another building. And so you'll find that if you use the generic risk assessment, it may be something which everybody pays lip service to and knows is there, but nobody really engages with, and it may miss various issues which would vary between work premises. However, there is no denying the fact that it is actually very useful and can save you an awful lot of time and effort if you start off with a model or generic risk assessment and then start developing the risk assessments for your specific work premises from that. Ensure it is reviewed, we've covered. It should include routine and non-routine activities. And so non-routine, I mean reasonably foreseeable. So you should consider if you have equipment, that equipment at some point is going to be maintained. And so you're going to have someone come in and do checks on it. And it's very often the maintenance people for equipment that are the people that suffer harm because they do things like disabling the interlocks in order to, on the guarding, in order to carry out work to the unit. Other things might be reasonably foreseeable, might be work experience students, employees getting pregnant, people suffering back injuries in their personal life and not being as able to carry out manual handling, and contractors working on site. And so you should consider the reasonably foreseeable, but not go to a point where you've got get to daft measures. So whereas he says also, whereas there's a competent person within the company, you shouldn't use someone outside your employment, basically because the person within the company is much more familiar with the risk assessment than someone outside of the company. And so if you bring in a consultant to do your risk assessments, then you run the risk of them missing things, particularly around how that workplace operates in practice and how sensible their suggested control measures are going to be. And so starting off with someone within the company and then drawing out the expertise of outsiders only when necessary is often the best way of going about things.